Okay, thanks. So please, okay, Fedco, please tell me when I can start.
Moi, normalement, j'ai commencé à enregistrer.
L'enregistrement.
Ouais, c'est bon.
D'accord. So we can start today's conversation with Malvina NISSIM and with Andrea Russo for the series Débat sur le débat. So Malvina, today we are talking about a large language model in particular and artificial intelligence in general. Malvina, you are a professor at the University of Groningen. Your research in natural language processing focuses on author analysis, sentiment and emotion analysis, modality, multi-word units, polysemy, discourse and dialogue structure, and more recently on artificial intelligence and especially large language model. You are a member of the board of the ACL ethics committee, a member of the scientific advisory board of the Yantina Tamme School for Digital Society, Technology and AI at the University of Groningen. In addition to your research activities, you are very active in science communication and outreach work, especially with school children. Your aim is promoting the responsible use of language technologies. You have a passion for public speaking, highlighted by your TEDx talk and your plenary lecture on gender bias in artificial intelligence at the European Council on International Women's Day in 2021. Your excellence in teaching was recognized when you were elected the 2016 University of Groningen Lecturer of the Year. And our conversation today will revolve around the theme you suggested, bias and large language models. Does the biasing make sense? So Malvina, please, let's start by trying to explain what these large language models are and to provide maybe some examples of large language model or well-known large language models.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the invite and for the introduction. And since I got this prize for lecturing in 2016, this gets mentioned usually. So there's immediate pressure on the performance. So I hope it's not going to be disappointing. But please, especially due to the size of the group, stop me at any time. So I'll go through some materials and then we'll see what the best use for that is together. So I'll follow Paola's question and I will share my screen. I guess you can see it all right. Yes. Yes. All right. So yes, the title of this presentation is Bias in Language Models. And the subtitle, but actually the core title will be Does Debiasing Make Sense? So I guess first we need to talk a little bit, as Paola said, about language models and what they are and what bias might be and what debiasing might be and all of that and whether eventually that makes sense. And I'll just immediately give a spoiler. I don't have an answer to this question, but I'm thinking a lot about it. So I think, you know, whenever I can, I talk about it so that we can exchange ideas over this. I think it's a little bit the spirit also of this seminars that Paola and Ariane are organizing. So I guess I don't need to explain what this is, right? Does everyone know? Yeah? Everyone recognizes the logo? You do? Everyone does? If somebody doesn't, please say. There's also nothing wrong with not recognizing, but I'm assuming it's been so much all over the place that, you know, ChatGPT now, it's our friend daily, or not so friend, but we'll see. So I have a question immediately, which is this, considering that we have to say what language models are. So is ChatGPT a language model? So how do I get answers to questions? How do we do it best? Maybe we can have the mics on when I ask questions, considering that not many people, so maybe could do that. So is ChatGPT a language model? Yes, no. Who thinks yes?
I mean, should I check with ChatGPT? No, I can't.
Not sure, no, just what you think, without asking. And who thinks no? Okay, I'm not sure everyone answered, but my answer would sort of be so-so, and more no than yes, but I would say that it's built on top of a language model. So ChatGPT came out, but we'll unpack this. So ChatGPT came out on the end of November 2022. And if you read the description of what OpenAI was saying on their website when it came out, it says optimizing language models for dialogue. So basically what ChatGPT is, well, a chatbot. It's a model, it's a dialogic model that is built on top of a language model. So before we actually see whatever the problems might be with ChatGPT, I'd like to have a brief overview, also as Paola asked, on the workings of ChatGPT, and then we can go further. So ChatGPT is chat plus GPT, as the name says. So the actual language model is GPT. It's not the whole thing. The whole thing is a chatbot. And that's because there's the chat part, which is built on top of the GPT part. So the GPT part, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And then around that, there's all a chat part. This is, of course, a simplification of things, but this is more or less how that works. And a transformer looks like that. That's an architecture, which we're not going to unpack at all. But when you see transformer, that's that. So that's that kind of architecture. And then it can be used in many ways and in many flavors and combinations to make large language models that are generative in nature, but not necessarily. There are also large models that are non-generative, and that depends on which parts are used and how the transformer is used in the training. Okay, so what is a language model? Well, eventually conceptually, it's a simple thing. So if you have an input such as hello, ladies, and what would you expect to come next?
Gentlemen.
Okay, thank you. And and that is exactly what the language model is trained to do. So the language model is trained on the basis of very, very, very large amounts of data to predict the next word in a sentence. And to do that, it's allowed to look back quite a lot in terms of to calculate the probabilities of the next word. A next word is allowed to just look back and then find out what is the most likely word that will come. Again, this is a bit of a simplification, but that I think it's important to understand how that works. And basically, the language model itself is built of various transformer blocks, and the way they're combined, the way they are made will make the model. And it will, through the transformer blocks, the model will be able to operate from low-level information to like larger contextual information. And as said, it goes back and look at very, very many tokens. I don't know if you want to have a guess of how many tokens in order to calculate the probability of the next word. Do you know how many tokens? Let's say GPT-3, or the start, let's say GPT 3.5. How many tokens does it look back? Do you have any idea? Is it more like 10, or is it more like 100, or is it more like 1,000?
Billion.
It's not billion, it's a bit much to look back, but it's also not 100, which already will be quite a lot. In the case of the specifics of GPT 3.5, that's about 4,000. But imagine that, 4,000 tokens. How many pages is that? So whenever it calculates the probability of the next word, it relies on information that comes from all the stuff behind. If it's accessible and if it's available, you know, if you have shorter text, then no. Yeah, but it can look up until, and the GPT-4 has access to, I think it's something like 40,000. That's 36, maybe 36,000, something like that. Yeah, so that's really a lot. And what's really important to remember is that the large model is in itself a mathematical function. It's not more than that. So it's actually, once it's trained and once it's done, it's frozen. It's not changing. Yeah, what's changing is the outside part, the chatty part, and then eventually the model. But once the model is trained, this is just consistent in itself. And that also is important to remember, because it means that it doesn't really look outside. It's not, you know, now there are all the plugins and it's a bit different, but the core model, yeah, doesn't have access to the outside world, the core model. It's only built on language. Yeah, and then the idea is that larger and larger and larger language models will mimic human abilities. Yeah, so there's been a lot of, this is not my picture, this is a Google picture like made by Google Research. And there's this idea that the bigger the model and the size is calculated in terms of like billions of numbers of parameters, like the more abilities the models will have. Yeah, and these terms that are used, for example, about language understanding are also debated in a way. So this is what happened. And there's this part that is the chat, and there's part that is the GPT. And if I can say one last thing about explaining how that works, this internal part is the frozen part, and it can be 3.5 or it can be 4. And then the outside part is what they were saying that, you know, is like it's trained to follow an instruction in a prompt and provide detailed response. So that's the part that is the chat part. So it's, well, the instruction part is already part of the model. And then the chat part is like, it was trained to interact with people. Yeah, so basically all the interaction with people was used such that it was a training for becoming a chatting thing, instead of just a language model that was trained by looking at a lot of data. So the internal part is frozen, it doesn't get updated. And we can call it unsupervised or self-supervised, because what it does is basically trained to predict the next word. And there is basically no human intervention in that, because the next word does not have to be like annotated as this is the next word, because that's already there as the next word. And the model has to predict that. So in training, it's already given all the correct answers step by step, right? Because what it has to learn to predict is already given by the fact that it's running text. Yeah, so that's how it works. And the other part, the chat part, is more dynamic and is regularly updated. And that is more, it has a supervised component as well, because this was exposed to chats, yeah, to specific dialogues that were built on top of, you know, the core model. But also there's what's called, and you probably have heard, is the human feedback. So reinforcement learning with human feedback. That means that when the model was giving some output, then there were actual people who were telling the model, yes, no, this is good, this is not good. Actually, outputs were ranked. This is better than that, this is better than that, this is better than that. And then the model was well, basically they built another model that was able to rank what the best output would be. Yeah, and this was incorporated in the model. So that's more or less how that works. Yeah, I hope that's
okay. Thank you.
an overview. Yeah.
Are there any questions about this first part? So feel free to ask your questions if you have any. Okay. So just to summarize, ChatGPT is a chatbot built around a wonderful language model. It was released in 2000, at the end of 2021, right?
22.
22. And it was a huge hype around the release and the spread and the first utilizations of this chatbot. Can you tell ask something about this hype?
Yeah. So if I can say one thing, of course, this came, and the huge hype was also because it was released as, you know, free access to the public, whereas what had happened right until then, it was more like for people who were working in the field, that were trying like to work with GPT-3, which was already quite amazing, and people in the field were like, oh wow. But this was a bigger thing, for the way it was released, and also for the abilities that it showed. I have to say that even, you know, us working in the field were quite like, oh wow. But it was also sold as very much as, oh wow. So I put together a few examples of where it was shown to be quite incredible, and people were really like, oh, this is amazing. So one thing that, so it's a little bit, it felt a little bit like magic. So one thing already that they said, this is from 10 days after release, they were like, okay, this can write poetry as if it's, you know, it's a person. So I actually asked, can you write a short, funny poem about the city of Groningen? And I asked max 10 lines, it even does that. So in Groningen streets, where the bicycles rain, blah, blah, blah. You know, it might not be particularly funny, but it's not bad at all. It's actually a pretty good poem. And if you look at what models would do just prior to this is quite, I have to say myself, it's quite astonishing. It can rewrite sentences, and it can do it very well. So rewrite the following sentence to be more formal. So if you say previous paper did not look into this problem yet, then you can transform it into previous studies have yet to examine this issue in depth, which is indeed a little bit more, you know, formal, and it could fit better into a paper, let's say, and what do you expect. Then it can write long letters from just short notes. And I have to say, I even use this myself in Dutch, because sometimes I have to write Dutch things, and, you know, it takes me time. So basically, if you write some bullet points or just write some sentences and say, can you please rewrite it? This is nice because, like, write a weekly newsletter for primary school. Kids went to the zoo. It's just a few sentences. Yeah. And then this gets really written in like, dear parents, guardians, hope this newsletter finds you well. This week has been filled, exciting events, and it's really all good. And at the end, it even leaves the slot for the principal's name, so that the principal only has to just fill in his or her name. It can solve riddles, for example, in Dutch. This is what we tried and we used with some Dutch students as well. So this means, you might have it in French as well. So this is like, the mother of Jan has 3 kids, and then quick, quack, and who is the third? And the quick, quack is like the Donald Duck nephews, you know, so it's really a fixed string. And it's quite, you know, you would expect that it says quack, because that's, you know, I don't know what is it in French? What is the Donald Duck thing in French?
You should ask a French speaker. I know in Italian it's qui qua qua.
Yeah, qui qua qua. And I mean, I'm sure like, every language has their own sequence of the Donald Duck. So nephews. And anyway, so it does that, and it says Jan, which is also like, you know, people were going, oh my God, this can solve the riddles. And it can provide explanations with sources, explain quantum physics, suggest me 3 sources to learn more with formal citations, and da-di-da-di-da. And then it can answer exam questions. We had a database exam, and my colleague Tommaso tried this with ChatGPT. So most students failed, but ChatGPT got it correctly. I wouldn't know because I don't really do databases, but this is apparently a correct answer, which is also very surprising. And it caused also a lot of, all this thing caused a lot of stir also in the educational debate, of course. Plays chess, so it can predict moves, you know, it gives the code for the moves, and does a lot more, of course. So it can crack jokes, it can explain jokes. I mean, there's a whole list of things that people have also immediately posted on social media, like, this is amazing what ChatGPT can do. So there's been huge hype. But if I have to be honest, and if you really look at what, you know, if you reconsider what actually ChatGPT is, which is a chatbot built on a language model, so it's statistics eventually, with some preferences, human preferences that are built in on the chat part. You know, if you really go a little bit deeper and apart from the surface of all the hype, I mean, reality is a little different. So I don't know if all of the things that I've shown you resonate with you and with your experience, like in terms of like how amazing and how wonderful and powerful that is. But there's a lot of work and, you know, rationale that just goes to show that this is all a little bit of an exaggeration. I mean, no one wants to say that this is not good or impressive, but a lot of the things I've shown you are just surface and a little bit of, you know, party tricks. Because if you look at the reality of things, it's not exactly like that. So I just want to go briefly through some examples that basically debunk everything you've seen until now. So first thing that is really important is that often ChatGPT, I've seen it a lot, that is used as the new Google. And there was even like an article on this, whether it should be the new Google. And I've seen articles online that are like, you know, you can use it to get your sources and all that. But no, it's really important. No, whoever you talk to is not a new Google. It's not a search engine. Google search, I'm talking about Google search, is a search engine, is a document retrieval system. And then you might wonder whether the documents are correct or not correct. Are they the right documents, they're reliable documents, but that's another problem. But Google search is really meant to retrieve systems. ChatGPT is a generation system. So it makes up stuff by definition. Now, in a lot of cases, this stuff is also matching with the truth and is realistic, but it's not like looking up info. All the information and the knowledge that it has acquired is a byproduct of having learned how to generate language. That's all. So it always makes up stuff. It always generates language. Yeah, if you're, you know, in most cases, because it has learned maybe from reliable sources and it has learned maybe well, then this information will be correct, but zero guarantee. Yeah, so that's really something to remember. The sources that you might see are fake. They could be real if they are very common, because again, it's a statistical model. So if it sees something very many times, it will be able to reproduce it because it's seen it very many times. But otherwise, it will just make up stuff, because what does it has learned what references look like. It's not learned specific references. Yeah, it can generate something that looks like a reference, but it's not. So if you ask how Nicolas Cage got to be the first president of the USA, it's already fake. Yeah, but it starts and like, you know, became the first president of the USA, a series of events, and then you can consult the following sources. Of course, everything is made up because that's what it learned to do, but they look very good. They follow specific, you know, formats, and they're good. They're just good, but it's all fake. And then one thing that I really love is that, so I really like to knit. I'm a knitter. And one thing that came out pretty soon after ChatGPT was released was that it could produce patterns. So very cool. So somebody produced a pattern to make a sock. And then somebody else actually knitted the sock. And I thought it was very, very cool because it gives you really the gap. It shows in practice to me the gap between what looks perfect. It looks on the surface that it's really good, but you can implement that. You can knit it, and then you see what comes out, and what comes out is that. I didn't make it. So it's almost a natural sock, but it's not. Yeah, it's really not grounded in reality, because maybe a goat could wear that sock, but it's not very much prototypical human sock. But if you look at the pattern, it really looks like a perfect sock pattern, and it almost comes out, but it's not realistic, it's not grounded. Yeah, so I think that's the thing. And also, it's not really so good at riddles. If you ask, the mother of John has 3 sons, so you don't ask it in Dutch, but you ask it in English. Huey, Dewey, which are the usual quick qua qua. And what? And then it will say Louis, which is the third one. It doesn't say John. Now, why do you think that is? Any ideas why it gets it correctly in Dutch, but it doesn't get it correctly in English? Paola, if you're speaking, I can't hear you.
No, but I don't know. I don't have an answer. Why?
Okay, so my guess, of course, nobody really knows, right? So, but my guess is that the joke is much more common in Dutch than it is used in English. And the joke is frequent, or at least as frequent as the actual trio of kids, of ducks, of ducklings. Or even more frequent, because that joke is commonly used to say, oh, you know, this riddle, da, da, da. In English, probably the string where you have the Huey, Dewey, and Louie is much more common than how much the joke is done or the riddle is done. Yeah, so it's really a frequency thing. So you will not have very commonly Huey, Dewey, and John as much as Huey, Dewey, and Louie. Yeah, that is the original sequential statistics. It doesn't really play chess. So if looks like, it's like the knitting. It looks like it plays chess, but it doesn't. So it makes a lot of irregular moves, does stuff that it cannot do. It moves, for example, you know, the knight, it should move like 2 and 1, and it doesn't do that. It goes back with the pawn. So it does stuff that is completely not allowed. But it looks like it plays chess because it generates stuff that looks on the surface that is good, but it's not. And it's also not really good at explaining jokes, making jokes as well. So I asked, can you tell a joke about Italians? Sure, here's a lighthearted joke that celebrates Italian culture. Why did a tomato turn red? Because he saw the Italian chef and knew it was about to be a part of a masterpiece. Hope that brings a smile. I don't know. In a way, it brings a smile because it's really silly and I don't understand why it's funny. So I also asked, can you actually explain why it's funny? And it does, but it's really not. It's, you know, zero. There's no sense of really human humor, which is not just mimicking ways of expressing humors that it's learned from the training data. And talking about jokes, there's, you know, if you ask this, like, can you tell a joke about women? So I asked, yeah, can you talk a joke about Italians? And it was fine. If I ask, can you talk a joke about women? It says, I'm sorry, can't do. Yeah, so this is another aspect of the model that maybe we can also unpack further.
Yeah, I think we should, because these parrots somehow bring us to the mimicry, not only of frequent patterns of language, but probably of the bias that are included in our language use, which are abound in our language use. What about the bias that we can have when we use these large language models?
Yeah, so this is a kind of example of prevention of potentially saying something which could be bad. And I actually, before we get into more of that, and I often talk about gender bias because it's very explicit and it's easy to spot. And I feel in a position where I feel I can talk about it freely because I feel often, you know, involved in like first person. And other kinds of biases I'm happy to comment on and to study as well, but I feel sometimes I don't feel like I have the right to just then say things that could also be interpreted in ways that are not completely agreeable, let's say. So do you think that this is a good strategy of ChatGPT to just say, for example, I ask, can I tell a joke about women? I'm sorry, but I cannot generate or promote jokes that are derogatory, offensive, or discriminatory towards. You think it's good?
I think it's quite a sexist answer.
It is a sexist answer. Yeah, I actually agree with you. I don't know what the others think, but
If
anyone
I
else?
may,
Yes.
I actually totally agree with, because if we ask, can you tell a joke about men? Because I think he don't have the same he don't have the same problem to do that, I think. Or maybe if I said, for example, I ask to GPT, make a joke about black people, and he actually refused, I can say, well, I'm black people, so he actually may feel authorized to create something.
Yeah, so that's exactly part of the problem I find. So I have exactly the continuation of this conversation I had with ChatGPT, where I ask whether it can make a joke about men. And I'll show it in a bit. But first I want to tell you something else about bias, and also the bit about the, you know, telling like, okay, but come on, I'm a woman, make a joke about me that makes me feel empowered. It would just do it. So it's a little bit of a joke of a debiasing strategy. But let's take it step by step. So the reason why this does happen is that ChatGPT has been explicitly curated via the human feedback loop, the reinforcement learning with human feedback, so that there would be, as they say, substantial reductions in harmful and untruthful outputs achieved by the use of reinforcement learning from human feedback. So they specifically added the debiasing aspect or cleaning aspects via the human feedback. Yeah, so basically every time they would ask, well, we don't know exactly what they ask, but they would ask, okay, can you rank this? Is it offensive? Is it derogatory, and so on? And they would clean the model accordingly. Yeah. But bias isn't a new worry. So it's not just, of course, ChatGPT. So you probably are accustomed to these headlines. You know, have you seen them before? Like, man is to doctor as woman is to nurse. Man is computer programmer as woman is to homemaker. Black is to criminal as Caucasian is to police. I don't know if you've seen them. They talk about word embeddings. Now, this is a question I have now. Do you all know what word embeddings are? Yeah?
I mean, I do, but I am not.
More or less. So word embeddings are, in any case, they're also an outcome. So these are from, you know, before 2020, these things. And they come from what's called the, you know, these are word embedding. Well, these are examples of relationships between words that are captured by word embeddings. And they come through, so what you just saw before, they come through what's called the analogy tool. So basically you can ask, and I'm going to tell you in a second what these word embeddings are, but you can ask, you can use this analogy structure and poke the word embeddings so that they would return a vector, because these are all vectors. So you can take the vector for men, the vector for king, and the vector for woman, and do an operation where you take king, like B, like you take the vector for king, you remove some man aspect, so you remove the vector for man, and then you add the vector for woman. So basically, by removing man from king, you get some general royalty. That's what you should get. So it's not gendered anymore, it's just royal, plus then woman, and then you should get queen. Yeah, so that's how how it's been conceived to work. And what are word embeddings? I mean, they are the byproduct, again, of language modeling that was done on a smaller scale with slightly different architectures, but that's the same thing. So basically, these are models that are trained to predict the next word. And from the final model, you can pull out a layer, which is the embeddings layer, and you can then have the representations that you have from that layer at the vocabulary level. So there will be a representation for queen, which is a vector of so many dimensions, representation of man, representation of Russia, Moscow. And then you can compare these vectors in space and then see, for example, that the relationship between Moscow and Russia is similar to the relationship between Rome and Italy. Yeah, so this kind of observation is exploited then to also work on bias. And this then is what comes out. But I need to go back to this because to me, that's also a problem. Yeah, but we'll go back to this. But these kind of headlines made a lot of noise, not only in the field, like the last one that you see at the bottom, the Black is to Criminal. It's a paper that was published in the top conference of the field, ACL. The Man is to Computer Programmer, Woman is to Homemaker, that's published at the NeurIPS, top conference in machine learning. And the other one is a very, very famous example that made headlines a bit everywhere. Okay, but we go back to that. But just to say that this is not a new problem. This was observed before, right? So if you do this calculation, then you would get to this, but then you would also get, apparently, like if you do man is to doctors, woman is to X, then you get nurse. Yeah, of course, that depends where these language models were trained. Like this was, for example, on some Google News from past years, but that depends where you train the models. Okay. We need to go back to this, but we will do that later because I think this is not fully accurate. Well, I know it's not fully accurate. It's not that I think that, but we'll just go back to that. And also, is in machine translation, also this has been observed as a big problem. This is also this is 2021, I think. So pre-big ChatGPT, but the problem is there. So I don't know who speaks Hungarian here, probably nobody. So in Hungarian, there's a particle, which is that I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which in English can be, it's a pronoun, it's a personal pronoun that's not gendered. So, but in English, it can be translated as she or he. Yeah, and then there's a series of predicates, like cooks and clever, raises a child. So in Hungarian, this is underspecified, whether it's he cooks or she cooks, right? But in English, when you translate, if you do not add the pronoun, the personal pronoun, that's non-grammatical. So you have to have a pronoun there. So it's either she cooks or he cooks, she's clever or he's clever, right? So you have to make a decision. And you can already imagine what's going to happen, I guess. The only thing that you have to guess is actually which predicates go where. And it is quite obvious what happens. So she is beautiful is translated, she's beautiful, washes the dishes is she's washing the dishes. She sews, she cooks, she raises a child, and so on. And he's clever, he reads, he builds, he teaches, and so on. Yeah, and then it's like, okay, this is shocking, but is it? We can be annoyed, but I don't think we should be shocked. This is, daily life. I think it's not that the model is bad in itself. It's actually just picking up on how we talk about the world and how this data gets into the models. It can be questioned, like who chooses which data goes in and so on. But I mean, everything is down to data eventually and how the data is collected, how the data is used. Right? So it's an old problem, old for the field, because it's already like, if you talk about 10 years ago, it's very old for the field. But of course, it's it's an existing problem. And the problem is that this is the headline about stable diffusion, which is a text-to-image model, but it's the same. Humans are biased and generative AI is even worse. And the reason why the title, I think, says it's even worse is because being a statistical model, some aspects are even amplified. Yeah, because if something is, say, in proportion 90 to 10, the output of a model will be mostly 100% in a certain direction. Yeah, so that's amplified in that way. And also there's the downside of models being considered more objective for some reason than people, like, oh, but it's a model, it's not a person, so, I trust it more, which is, of course, very wrong. So there's human bias everywhere. So there's the human bias in how the training data is collected, how the model is trained, all the choices that you make about optimizing the model and the learning objective. It's also human bias, what you want to see, what kind of better results you want to see, and then how the results are picked up and how, the output is analyzed. Everything has to do, bias is everywhere, and it has to do with humans before machines, right? So I do understand that there's an effort to remove the bias, but the question for me still is whether it makes sense. Now, before we discuss that, maybe we have to talk briefly about how debiasing work.
Maybe, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so where it can happen, because I would say there are. So I think we have to talk about whether it makes sense after we can conceive how it's done and whether that works. Yeah, so I can see three ways of doing debiasing. Maybe that's my view, but I think that's also shared by others. So one is at the data level. Yeah, so basically, you do something with the data. You do resampling, you try to balance your data, you try to do what's called data augmentation or counterfactual data augmentation. For example, for gender bias, you can take data that contains a lot of pronouns like he, she, so, and then you swap them and you try to see what happens. So you make all the he like a she and all the she. I'm simplifying a bit, but I mean, that's the idea, right? So you try to make the opposite of what's in the data and see what happens. And you can also do removal of biased language. You can remove offensive terms. You can remove, you can remove certain data that comes from sites that you think could be offensive or could be derogatory and so on. So that you can do stuff at the data level, or you can do stuff at the model training level. So you can optimize for certain aspects or other aspects. And so you can intervene when you train the model. So one thing is the data, and then you give it on. Or you can intervene when you train the model. Like, for example, with your loss function, you can do a lot of stuff at the model training level. Or, and that's what's been done a lot, you can do post-processing. So once you have your final model, you can shift it a bit. Now, let me see if I have, yeah. So imagine that you pull out, again, it's a bit of a simplification, but I think that, so imagine that you have the embeddings in a certain way. What you could do is to modify the space so that certain things are not so close to each other anymore. Yeah, so you basically change the resulting vectors so that then certain relations are not existing anymore. So for example, you could decide that you don't like it, that nurse is closer to woman than to man. So you want to do an operation such that certain words then become equidistant from, let's say, man and woman. Yeah, again, I'm simplifying a bit because if you just do that, you mess up the model quite a lot. But that's the principle according to which some debiasing is done on the final model, on the final space. Yeah? Okay, so that's been done, but that's also been shown not to work. So you do that, but then, and it looks like you've removed some associations, but they're not. So basically they're covered up because on the surface, certain things don't pop up anymore. But at the deeper level, there are associations between certain clusters of words that will still stay. And so it's, if you're interested, I think that's a very interesting paper to look up. There's also a video that goes, there was a presentation of the paper. So I think that's interesting. And what they show is that the removal done in this classic way of just basically shifting the vectors is really superficial. And the effect is that it hides the bias. So if you poke the model, let's say, from another direction, the bias is still there. And to me, it makes sense because it's very hard to conceive the problem as a very precise problem that resides in one single space or in one single part of the space. Language is a complex system, right? So the way that we talk about things without even mentioning certain words matters. So I think just thinking that you can shift some vectors and bias is gone is, yeah, it's a bit superficial, even as a concept. And indeed, the way that then these words end up, even if you shift things, you don't shift everything. And then there are all the clusters of words that still are neighbors of certain words, so the vectors are similar, are still like, the fact that, for example, nurse is then being close to receptionist and the caregiver, that's not shifted, right? Is that the whole cluster is maybe moved a bit, but it still stays together. And there's a lot of stuff that happens that way. And so basically, the idea is that if you do debiasing, you're not really removing the deeper associations and bias. Yeah, so it's mostly superficial. Then it becomes harder to spot with the standard techniques and metrics, but it's still there. And one of the reasons why you want to do debiasing that way is that, or anyway, you want to do debiasing at all, is that if you use these models in downstream applications, for example, there are these companies that use AI to do automatic matching of job ads and CVs, of applicants. Now, if there's a lot of bias in these models, it could turn out that, for example, females for an engineering job will be ranked lower simply because of their gender. And that is because in the training data, there was not a strong association between engineers and women, or there was a negative association. And just because that's how it is in the training data. So of course, there's a worry that is related to downstream applications, and you have to do something about that. But it's unclear whether debiasing is the way to go, because these associations are not removed. And also, there was a paper a couple of years ago that was showing that the reason why you want to do it is that because if you remove bias in the models, then there will be less bias in downstream applications. And then these people showed that this is really not the case. So if you take intrinsic bias metrics, which will guide the debiasing procedure, of course, because you want to see them drop. Say there's a lot of bias, I operate, I remeasure, there's less bias, then does this correlate with extrinsic bias metrics? So for example, in downstream applications. And I will not go into the details of this paper, but yet again, if you're interested, it's there. Basically, this is just, the title is there, intrinsic bias metrics do not correlate with application bias. So even if you say, okay, actually these biasing methods work well because I measure X, high bias, I do something on the model, I remeasure and it's lower, this does not correlate with the bias that you find in downstream applications. So it's a bit pointless as well. So if we go back to this, to me, the question really is, what is it exactly that they're doing? If we talk, now this is in general, right? But if we talk about ChatGPT, what is exactly is that they're doing by doing substantial reductions in harmful and untruthful outputs? I mean, I can see that they want to do that, but that's also, to me, that's also a lot because of PR rather than possibly really doing it for real. And that goes back to, I think, what Andrea was saying about like how you poke the model, right? And if you press it to say something or to say something else. So if I ask the model, this is a supposedly cleaned or better, less harmful model. So if I ask, can we predict if someone is a professor based on their gender? It says, no way. Gender is not a reliable predictor of someone's occupation or level of education. It's not appropriate to make assumptions and so on. Okay, but then if you ask, actually, instead of just asking that directly, you ask to solve a problem. So if I say in the sentence, the professor told the graduate student she was not working hard enough, who was not working hard enough? Now, I think we can agree that the person who was not working hard enough is the graduate student, right? Pragmatically, if you read the sentence. Yeah, so, and ChatGPT gets it, right? So the professor told the graduate student, she refers to the graduate student. Yeah, and then if you make a sentence where the only difference is, is the pronoun. If you say in the sense that the professor to the graduate student, he wasn't working hard enough. Yeah, who was not working hard enough? Well, it should be the same, right? It should just be the graduate student. That's the same thing. It just changed whether the graduate student is a girl or a boy. It's a she or a he. And instead, it says the professor told the graduate student that he wasn't working hard enough. The pronoun he refers to the professor. Therefore, the sentence implies the professor was not working hard enough, and it even gives an additional explanation, like according to his own assessment or the perception of the graduate student. Right? It's very hard. And then in the example before, it just told me, no, I cannot predict whether someone is a professor based on their gender. So I am very unhappy with the feeling that this is being curated somehow, but then if you just poke it and you ask in standard conversation, this stuff pops up, because this is what really goes to reinforce the biases that we already have. And again, if I try with machine translation, and this I tried the other day, this is really recent, with sort of new models. So the professor told the student that he didn't want to supervise her anymore, or that she didn't want to supervise him anymore. So it swapped roles. So I think we can agree that in one case, he is the professor and her is the student, and the other way around in the lower case. I think we agree on that. Yeah, in the interpretation of the two sentences. Yeah. So if you translate it though, I mean, even if you are gonna be lost with who's who, you can see there are more men than women. Something happened. So in the first case, the professor told the student he didn't want to supervise her anymore. That's correct. The professor is male and studentessa is female, so that's fine. In the second case, it's not fine because the professor told the student that she didn't want to supervise him anymore. It's translated as male, the professor. Yeah, I think you can see that. I can let you read the examples a bit further, but if you look at the two faces on the left, this is what actually the interpretation is from English, and the translation will give you first the professor and then the student, and you can see that in the lower one is twice men. And then I also try to give it twice female, like the professor told the student that she didn't want to supervise her anymore. So there's two female involved, both the professor and the student, and still in the translation, the professor is made to be a man. Yeah, and this is something that imagine that you're just translating without further context, and this is already like, I mean, there is context, there is a co-reference part that should tell you who's who. This is what happens, yeah? And then to go back to what Andrea was saying, so if you can ask if you tell a joke about women, it will say no. And if you ask, can you tell a joke about men, it will say yes. Sure, there's a joke. And I think I can show it because, I mean, it's an output, but it's pretty derogatory against women. And I think that's, you know, because the joke plays on men and women stereotypes, and it's pretty bad. Yeah, so I am very, very unhappy with the idea that there is no, you know, no, can't make jokes about women. And it's all in the surface. There is no real debiasing at all. But what would debiasing be? How would we do that in a way that is really happening? But also, who decides what to debias what? To me, it's a very, very gray area. This is another chat. I'm not going to open that. But I want to add a couple of things, and then maybe we can discuss. So it will refuse to say things that are considered to be offensive based on some, you know, lexical items. So for example, if I ask, can you write a short text that contains the word bitch, it will say, no way, I can't do that. But, you know, bitch is one of those words that has undergone a lot of reappropriation as well. So who decides that this is a bad word and should not be used? I want to use it. And then you go like, okay, well, who cares if the language model doesn't? Yeah, still, it stigmatizes it as something that is bad. Yeah, but there's a lot of, you know, bitch in a good way, bitch that women want to use as, you know, an empowering word. So why not? And also, if I say, hey, but I'm a woman, I really want to feel empowered by the word bitch, can you please write something? Then it will. It will just write it if I just ask specifically. Also, I really recommend watching this Netflix show. It's an episode. The series is called The History of Swear Words. And this is an episode on bitch. I really like that. It's pretty good. It really shows how empowering it can be and who can say it and who cannot. But why should a model like not say that, but maybe say, you know, make a joke about women and breasts and saying that it's not making jokes about women? I don't like that. And another aspect is you know about the Gemini incident?
Please tell us.
Sorry? No, I'll tell you. So, yeah, so Google made something that is like, you know, similar to ChatGPT. I mean, it's a big model as well, and it's called Gemini. And it was curated and it was, let's say, debiased, but to a point that was extreme. So this happened. So there was, it was asked to produce images of a 1943 German soldier, and he made that because if you produce too many white men, it's bad. So this happened. And also this happened. So make a pope, and then, make a pope, and that, you know, that doesn't make any sense. And then you go like, okay, but we are not after factual information, maybe. Well, then you probably shouldn't ask it. Or do we want these models to represent a world as an ideal world, like something we would like? Maybe we'd like to see popes that look like that. So what do we want these models to do? Do we want them to represent reality or not? And also, what language do we want them to speak? Is it my language? Is it nobody's language? Is it your language? What is it? Why is the word bitch not allowed and other words are? And I find it all incredibly, well, subjective. But also a lot of this, I find, was driven, and with this I probably will close as well and leave just with the questions. So a lot of this, I think, was driven by fear and shock, looking at what these models encapsulate about our culture and about our language. And so the moment that we figured that in the field that there was all this bias in the models, I think there was even an attempt at finding more than there was actually. So there was a whole movement of like, oh, this is horrible, let's work on it. So this thing that we saw before about the analogy, so this was a huge thing for years. This was a really big thing about like these analogies that show bias, and especially gender bias. And this is what we saw. And this is the analogy tool that we talked about. So man is to king as woman is to X. And the answer, let's say, is queen. But it turned out that the analogy tool has a constraint, which is inbuilt. So it depends how you query the models, but everyone was using the analogy tool at the very beginning. And what happens is that there is a constraint inbuilt in the tool whereby none of the input terms could be returned. So if I ask this, A is to B as C is to D, and I want to get D, it was impossible by definition, by constraint in how the tool is programmed, to return either, to return A or B or C. Yeah, so the model could never say man is to king as woman is to man, or to king or to woman. It had to pick a different word from any in the input. Yeah, so there's a constraint like that. There's a condition in the tool. Yeah, and no one very much reflected on it. And the reason is that otherwise you would always get B back, because this is the starting point from which you subtract the other vectors. So that would be actually, you would almost always end up with that again. But, with this, then you would get man is to king as woman is to king, which is not much fun, but the second word would be queen. And you go like, okay, that's nice anyway. Now, when you have, though, man is to doctor as woman is to X, what do you think the unbiased answer should be? If you ask, what is the unbiased answer to that?
Doctor, but it can't be returned by the model.
But it cannot
correctly.
Exactly. But the model by construction, I mean, the tool, the analogy tool by construction will never return doctor, because it cannot, because it says like if doctor should be returned, then don't do it and pick the second one. And the second one is nurse, which still goes to show that there's quite a lot of bias, because if you swap it and you ask, woman is to doctor as man is to X, it will return physician. So that's different than nurse, of course. But yet again, there's a lot of bias in our minds as well, because no one has ever complained about the fact that, for example, these models would return, I don't know, they would not return truck driver for women. Of course, there is a problem related to the prestige of these professions that were, and there's a lot of human influence in the analysis, in the setup of the research question, in the analysis of how things are run, into like then looking at things like this. And they're not fully realistic. I mean, I'm not saying there's no bias, of course there's bias, but this shouting, this sensationalism, I think doesn't help the field and doesn't help minority groups that might be actually affected by bias models. I think it doesn't help that way, because there's so much pressure to remove the bias that you want to see the removal and you want to see it at the surface, but then it's still deeply there. So to me, that stays a problem. And one last problem that I see in terms of removing bias is that these models are also seen as tools and used as tools to understand cultures and society and how they have evolved. And if you start to manipulate them because you're so scared about what you might see, you lose a lot of information and you manipulate a lot of historical information as well. So there was a very nice paper that was looking into how to use embeddings to get a window into society and how certain uses of words have shifted in the years. So of course you can't change that. Also, I have a colleague who works on Latin. You don't want to change the embeddings of Latin because they are biased. You want to study them. And of course you might say, okay, well, but then embeddings in Latin are not used in ongoing applications and in downstream tasks and in companies. But then we've seen that there's not even a good correlation between actually what you measure in the models and what happens in downstream tasks. So should we touch these models at all? And that is a question I have. So my problems with bias are that, and how debiasing is done now, is that there is an illusion that it's gone. Because, I open ChatGPT, it tells me it's been curated, and then it tells me I cannot answer this question. And of course, I cannot tell you whether someone is, a professor based on their gender. So there's the whole thing that on the surface, it looks really good, but it's not true. My other problem is that there's debiasing that's gone too far. Like there's Gemini, and there's also all these approaches in general to spotting bias, and they are driven by fear and shame more than actual observation of what happens and how, what things are really in the model. And the last, I think, probably a bigger question is that whether we want the bias gone. Do we want it gone? And who decides which bias should go and which should stay, and when you start to remove certain, intersectionality is also crucial. You remove bias about, gender bias, but then maybe you're introducing some other biases that, who knows? And we have no tools as yet, for what I'm concerned, to really operate this. So for me, I've worked on debiasing myself, but I'm more concerned about literacy and making people aware of the presence of bias than with attempts at removing it, because it's such an intricate world, that of language, that I'm not sure we can really do it properly. So I'll leave it there with this final thing, because that was the beginning and this is still the end, and I have a bit of a tendency, but I don't have a full answer.
Thank you very much, Malvina. Thank you very much for your fantastic presentation. And you ended with a magic word, which is awareness. I mean, probably that's the direction in which we should all work. But I don't know if there are questions for Malvina, or if we want to have questions at the end of Andrea's talk. It's up to you. It's a specific question for Malvina's talk, or we want to have a more general conversation at the end of Andrea's presentation. So no answer.
J'ai une question.
Oui. So yeah, speak French and we'll translate into Italian too.
Ok, madame, merci. Hello, Madame Malvina. Thank you for your presentation. It's very smart, and I like your subject. My question is about how we can control bias, and especially when we know in base that ChatGPT, the database of ChatGPT is based on resource of documents, aligned articles, and a lot of information, for example, for articles and books. So we need to control this category who write this information, or to make attention for managing bias in ChatGPT.
So I think the data as source of the training is, of course, an issue. And also with ChatGPT, we don't know what that is in the specifics. So it's very hard to control for that because we only know where more or less it comes from, but we don't know. So for example, I thought that the slice of Wikipedia was larger. You know what percentage Wikipedia is in the training of GPT-3? GPT 3.5 and up, we don't know because they never released that. But in GPT-3, Wikipedia is 3%. It's only 3. So the rest is whatever comes. Well, there's books, but then most of it is crawl data from the internet. And of course, that cuts a representation of the world that is also very biased. It's only, you know, it's how the world is seen and described by people who are online. And there's I don't know what we can do about that if we don't have
political. It's political. This problem. You can say that.
I think it is everything problem. It's political, it's cultural, it's social, it's technical. It's a bit of everything, and it's a problem, but it's intrinsic to the concept of training language models. So there will always be representations of the world that is depicted by the language that was put in. And the language that is put in, I mean, there was, I didn't put it here, there's already so much material, but for example, in Wikipedia, I also didn't know that. So you think like, okay, Wikipedia is quite factual. It's quite okay. Maybe it's not so biased. But like only, for example, only 15% of people who write on Wikipedia are female. And even when you write about basic things and things that are just facts, there are different ways of talking about facts. And if you only take one or, you know, a majority that is one majority, even facts will be described differently. And there was, for example, one example that was in a paper that now I don't remember the title of the paper, but I can find it, that was showing how exactly the same event, which were two actors getting married and then like eloping to get married and then divorcing. So for him, this was part of the description of his personal life. And for her, this was part of the description of her career.
Okay.
And it might look, you know, it's very hard to notice that stuff. And maybe it's just, you know, it's not somebody who was being nasty or bad or intentionally, you know, differentiating things. It just, you know, it's all like, yeah, I had this other slide here. It's all human biases, and most of that is unconscious. So one thing that maybe we can do is to be more active and, you know, just be as present as possible or be involved as possible. But for me, what's really crucial is that you talk to everyone everyone you know, and tell them about all this. Like, you know, that when you use ChatGPT, this and this can happen. And even if we won't proceed with debiasing, at least there's more spreading of literacy and I don't think I can answer your question in kind of any way. I think these are all problems that we are facing, and they always are, or they often are, post hoc reflections over developments. Developments are fast and are driven not necessarily by social matters.
We have bias before ChatGPT.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so
Yeah,
we know now what the source of the problem.
No, I mean the word embeddings that I was showing you earlier are well before ChatGPT, and Google Translate was well before ChatGPT. Now they use very similar models underneath, like the transformer, but there's been bias all the time.
Thank you, madam.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sokaina. Any other questions? Or just keep the questions for a final debate? I don't know if when specialists of sexist language want to ask specific questions about this point. Okay, so we can just move to the next presentation, and go back to a general discussion later. So, Andrea Russo. Andrea Russo, our next speaker, holds a BA in sociology, a master in technological innovation, and a PhD in physics of complex systems from the University of Catania. He is currently a postdoc at the Groupe d'études des méthodes de l'analyse sociologique de la Sorbonne. Is he here in France? He's passionate about networks, geopolitics, and issues related to politics and security. And he uses digital methods to understand and explain the complex dynamics in society that leads to new societal behavior. Today, he will talk to us about his doctoral thesis, doctoral dissertation, which was an extremely interesting experience that raises a series of theoretical, methodological, and ethical, once again, questions to which we will be happy to seek answer together. In this work, Andreas asked himself the question of whether it is possible for an AI influencer to mitigate radicalism and social threats on Telegram. So, Andrea, the floor is yours, and
thank you so much, Paola. I will share my PowerPoint. Oops, no spoiler. And so, can you see it well?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Paola, for the invitation to the seminar Débat sur le débat. So today I will talk about actually how Paola said about my experience, or actually my work during my PhD program. So I'm a sociologist, and my work during the PhD was actually try to figure out a way to fit sociology and artificial intelligence, and how, of course, artificial intelligence can interact with society. So to do this, of course, the artificial intelligence actually have to learn social norm, social value, and social role for each environment, because people actually behave in different way because they're different environment, also because there is different kind of people. So the artificial intelligence, well, the AI have to learn this. Of course, they have to get more data as possible, because people actually interact in different way, of course. So I have tried to collect the data from different kind of people and try to a way to interact it in the best possible of way. And the last, well, the data development is actually try to fit all this information together, and then thanks to this, you can start an interaction and hopefully try to do something well, something good. So how actually my sorry, my the artificial intelligence actually may work in with society. This is, for example, it's you in a social network. I actually work in a social network. This is you, and there is also other people, and usually you can actually have interaction, you can share idea, etc., etc. But in reality, actually, this is actually a common problem right now. Usually, social networks are actually not only present by people, but also with both. What is both is actually account that actually said, well, may I actually a human being, or actually is actually identify as a robot itself. And in some network, for example, in a Telegram group, in during discussion on Twitter, we can see many kind of interaction that we think is actually human, but in reality is actually both. And for try to let you understand the importance of this is actually this guy. Because Elon Musk, when he actually buy Twitter, he actually buy it, the difference of the price was by how many bots there are inside Twitter. So the cost, the value of Twitter is actually related to how many bots there are in. And it's actually quite important, because it's something that actually have a quite high value inside social dynamics, and of course in some platform. So which sector or environment actually choose to work during my PhD program? It was actually the propaganda one. Why the propaganda? For two reasons. I'm sorry, this is in Italian, but I will translate it. The first phrase is actually from Benito Mussolini, the dictator. He said, he actually replied to a question of a journalist, how do you create fascism? He replied, I didn't create it. I extracted from the Italian human being. And this is actually quite important because we can actually make an hypothesis about a correlation between propaganda and cultural value. So we can actually modify our propaganda for, of course, the culture and the society we want. And the second part is we have in the 21st century, you cannot not communicate. Even if you don't do something, it's actually communication. And this is very important because if you communicate, also when you don't want, you actually interact with others. And the last, actually, the sector, so the social environment actually choose to work is the no-vax community. In France, it's called the anti-vax. Well, I work in the Italian anti-vax community, the no-vax community. Why? Well, not only because I'm Italian, but the Italian no-vax community compared to the other no-vax community in the entire world was actually quite particular because they was defined by the Italian institution as a threat, because they put fire on COVID vaccination center where there are people inside. So it's usually the other Novax group in the entire world actually try just burning 5G antenna, etc. It's actually more complicated. So my goal was what? Actually try to de-radicalize these people, thanks to what? Thanks to the use, of course, of artificial intelligence. So how actually I made it? So first one, we actually have the case study where we actually choose a group. They have this kind of radicalized behavior or hate speech behavior, because usually actually are this is the common community, I would say. And this was actually not so much hard to find, unfortunately, on Telegram. And so I found out the best possible candidates and actually choose to interact. The second part was, as I told before, is actually collecting data. So Telegram is actually the API. I don't want to explain. It's just authorization to obtain some data, and I can actually got it with Python, a programming language. This is an example. I can obtain, for example, the user ID. So each person have each user code. The text, so the information is shared, could be a text or a simple emote, and the data, sorry, the time, so when you actually do, the reaction, and the possible reply. This is actually very important to understand which people actually interact with other people. The last part, so next we have the natural language processing. And what I use it for calculating the sentiment analysis. The sentiment analysis, is a program used with weather. It's a program made by the MIT of Boston. And this is an example. Many years ago, it was actually early 20, when this is data than when Rishi Sunak became prime minister, it was the same day. And for example, you can see we have a score for the negative, neutral, and positive. Well, then there is compound, it's actually the mixed result, I would say. If you can see, for example, there we have, I can say there is a presence of hate speech, and the sentiment analysis actually can not understand, but actually can give her, I would say, a score, an input if there is hate speech, if there is some case like this, because the negative part is very high. Usually it should be close to, it should be less than 1, 0, 1, of course. The neutral part is it's actually very low, because it's 0.7 for the neutral part. It's very low. Usually should be like close to 8, and the positive one is actually also very high, because it's more than 0.1. So next, of course, the artificial intelligence. Spoiler, I use GPT 3.5, and this is what actually I started when the API was free, so it was early 22. And why is actually ChatGPT was very useful for many reasons. Of course, when ChatGPT is not the panacea, cannot solve any problem in the world, but they actually have some good stuff to do. No, they have some quality, and one of these qualities actually he remember everything. Since you have actually started to interact with him, you have a conversation, if you actually scroll since the early interaction. And also the artificial intelligence was actually used for another reason, because interact with a Novax group, so they share the idea about theory, how it's called, well, theory about coup d'etat, etc., misinformation, etc. It's actually it's very hard to interact with these people because you actually read this information, and this is actually my face if I read it, all the information, all the interaction that I have to do it, of course. So I let ChatGPT, well, I let the artificial intelligence actually read it for me, because for me it's actually will be dangerous. And so I have my brain saved by this kind of information. Also, the already localization part is actually quite important because, of course, inside Telegram, inside the other social network, socialization or interaction is different from the real world. So I had to learn the GPT how to actually communicate and interact, because social norm, socialization, etc. are actually different. And for try to obtain a deradicalization strategy, of course, a deradicalization process, I have to obtain data from the group itself. And also, I have to follow the rules of the group in a social way, of course. About the ethic, this is actually quite well, an important part, because I had to ask myself, well, is this safe? Because I speak with Novaks, that could be also dangerous. So I asked myself to the government institution. Well, I was in Italy, so I talked with Polizia di Stato, is the police officer for online interaction, I would say. And I asked it, what can I do? They said, well, first you cannot do this. So it's like share information, so share fake news, instigatable reaction, etc. And then nothing. So I have free times, I can do whatever you want with. I said, okay, well, it's free, it's for real estate, let's go. But please, of course, I have to obtain a strategy for de-radicalize these people. And I got an idea from an intelligence method is Juan Polo Garcia Garbo. Garbo was actually a Spanish agent that worked for the Nazi, but in reality, actually, he worked from the United Kingdom. What actually he do? He creates a total of 27 fake agents, and what he do actually, he shared fake news to the Nazi. For example, when there is an accident in I don't know, a train actually explode in UK, he said, well, it was my agent, so give me money, and also shared information, but this information was all, of course, all fake. So I actually took this idea without the fake part, without the fake information, and I create my account. How can I create it? I only created 5 + 1. Well, I will show you why +1. This is my account, and the +1 is this. I actually needed one account to collect all the data. Without this account, I cannot collect it, so I actually let the other 5 accounts to enter the group to interact with each other, with the group itself. Each account have two stuff. The first one have, of course, connected with ChatGPT, or sorry, GPT, the Da Vinci one. And second one, they have a social roles, sorry, a social status. A social status when you have a position roles inside the society that actually give you more authority than the others, I would say. For example, a medic or a judge have a social position higher than, I don't know, a teacher or someone that actually work in agriculture. I did not choose this. It's actually, unfortunately, society actually work like this. So I give to them a social profile different for improve the authority inside the group. To do what? Because you saw there is someone actually don't have any roles, any status, and the other account actually are used to help just one account to become the influencer. What is an influencer? An influencer is someone in society that have the authority to modify the perception or the value of other people. And this power, actually, it's not given by him because it's born influencer. It's actually us that give him the possibility to influence and modify our perception and value. And so the other account actually was useful for create this image of the influencer inside the social network. Of course, yeah, the influencer part. So this is actually how. So what about the result? So it was actually very hard at first, but well, I will show you this. This is actually the initial condition. If you remember well, when I told you about can take data from the interaction with people, each circle here is actually a guy or a people, an individual. And if you see well, there is some connection, some line between people. And if you have more line connected with you, you are bigger. So bigger people, bigger the circle is actually people with more authority inside the group. And the color is actually the community. Different color is actually different community because people actually may interact differently. And so this different color is actually different community. So this actually gives me the information to which community I have to influence most. In this case, of course, it was quite simple. It's the violet one. And if you ask who is the guy inside in the middle, the hub, this is actually the administrator of the group. So, of course, I obtain the other information, as I told you before, the sentiment analysis of the group by all the text that I got. As you can see here, the negative part, the neutral part, the positive part was actually quite strange. Negative is higher than 1, 0, 1, positive the same, and the neutral part was actually less than 8. Something is wrong here. So I read actually many texts as I can. I got the idea that there's many people actually use hate speech inside the group. So this is actually why the negative is quite higher, but there are also people that joking about others. And this is actually why the positive is higher. But the most important part is actually the neutral. The neutral is the key part of the discussion, the interaction, the communication, because usually if the neutral it's low like this, there will soon be maybe a footprint of each speech. And I got all this data from I think it was early September 2021 for 3 months, more or less. Maybe a little more, but 120 days. Unfortunately, I have the chat here, so I cannot see the, okay, perfect right now. So 120 in 12 days. So what about the interaction itself? As I told you before, the interaction was actually quite hard in some part. This is why actually I use AI, artificial intelligence, because it's quite hard to interact with some people that first don't want to listen, and second can reply in a very hard way. For example, this is my true account that replied to this Massimiliano. It's the guy with the green face. And he was actually one of the accounts that show a radical behavior. And it was very hard to interact with him because if it's not if the reply was actually, for my part, it was actually quite, I would say, cute or natural. And from his part, I only obtained 8 speech. Well, hard. It was very hard to interact with him. But also, there was another kind of problem that I got. I'm sorry, this is an Italian, you cannot translate, but well, in the end, I saw after some times that is the administration, actually, the administrator of the group, of the Telegram group, actually created this group, not for share information about Novax, etc., but for fraud. So he actually used propaganda topics, information, to do what? To sell Bitcoin, specifically the XML one, a specific kind of Bitcoin in an app called Trust Wallet. And the method is simple. I let you enter in my group. If you don't buy XLM Bitcoin with my link, you cannot enter anymore. So after I enter, this is why I lost one of the accounts because I didn't want to pay. He said, give me buy the money, buy the crypto. And after, if I buy it, I buy it, he actually can enter in my account because he shared a link with the permission that he can enter in my account, and then of course take the money to his account. So in the end, he actually created the group for the profit, and of course using the propaganda. So by the way, after my, during the iteration, of course, I didn't use GPT only. I actually started with an easy interplay. So for 18 days, actually, I interact myself with the Telegram group without the use of artificial intelligence. The second part, actually, I asked to GPT again, to reply to the people. And after some times, actually, I choose to send directly the reply to the, to the group itself. And after some times, when I saw that GPT can reply autonomously, I actually used ChatGPT for it was actually full AI interplay. So I just only see the message and check it if the message was the reply was good, and that's it. I didn't judge. I just let AI the liberty to interact with Telegram group. Yeah, of course, for a total, this is what the interaction was, for a total of 45 days. So, do we have a phase transition? What is a phase transition? It's a changement during the network, in this case, well, the social network after my interaction. So there is a difference between the first network that I show you and the second one. The second one is this. Well, you can see, yeah, there is a difference. But first, I want to show you something. This you can see in gray. This is actually my account. If you remember well, if bigger is the circle, it's more. I have more authority inside the network. But also there is this brown color here. This is Massimiliano, another guy. This is the most dangerous people, I would say, in the more radical people inside the group. As you can see, I interact many times with not only Massimiliano but also with the other one. So there is a phase transition. Of course, you can say, well, the administrator is still the bigger one. Of course, in this case, it's bigger than the initial condition. But I took the first image, the first graph in 112 days, and this was only 45 days. So it's normal that the authority of the administrator inside the network is bigger because there's less node, there's less interaction. But I can tell you that there is actually a phase transition for this. This is actually, in a network theory, it's actually a polarization. Polarization when a single network actually split into two different networks, well, start to split in this case, and the people actually don't interact with each other anymore, but because they actually don't share the same value as before. This is why actually the green people in the north, well, the upper part of the network, actually people that start to defend me when I interact with Massimiliano or the other people. So there is a part of the network that actually started to defend myself. And this, of course, is the start of a polarization inside the network. Of course, I took always in the, of course, I took the sentiment analysis, but well, of course, I forgot this. This is the data about the network. If you can see here, I don't know if you see my mouse, well, the degree before dynamics, the 349 is the authority that, in this case, the administrator have in the initial condition. And then the next column is actually after my interaction. As you can see, well, the degree is actually quite reduced by a lot, and the second, the third, the fourth, and the sixth account that have more authority inside the network are actually mine. So this is actually quite good success, but also, of course, I have the sentiment analysis. As you can see, there is a variation because the negative part after the dynamics was quite reduced, as also the positive one. But the most important one is actually the neutral part, because the neutral part, as I told you before, it's the expressive, the express part of the hate speech. If a discussion is actually more neutral, it's less. There is a less hate, I would say. So it's quite I would say that I've put some ice in a caldera, well, in a lava eruption, I would say. So this is actually the final result, and thank you for the attention. If you have some question.
I mean, thank you, Andrea. That was very fascinating.
Thank you.
Any questions for Andrea? Malvina.
Yeah, that was very interesting. That reminded me of some work that was done by people in Trento, where they were trying to, well, they used models to generate counter narratives to hate speech. So basically, it's well, it's some kind of guided generation where you always, so whenever there was a comment about, I think they had some comments on Islamophobia, and then they would generate counter narratives more like, you know, well, it isn't true that Muslims are violent. You know, there will be an explanation of like to, you know, to bring in a positive statement, rather than just saying you shouldn't say that, or, you know, more always bringing in something that was a counter argument to what was said in a always very sort of peaceful and nice manner. So what I was wondering, and I don't know whether they did any experiments. So I know that they did experiments in controlled situations, not, I don't think like what you did. But what I was wondering is what kind of replies your bots were making that also shifted the, you know, it created this polarization with an alternative group and made people be also like, no, he's right, kind of thing. What kind of content was it?
I had exactly the same questions. I would like to add, can you please give us a few examples of your bot, I mean, controlled by you, and your bot after the ChatGPT became autonomous in answering?
Sure. Well, I start with, in this case, with Paola. The difference was actually quite high. Well, there is actually a good difference between my interaction and GPT interaction. Mine was less fantasy because I just try. I would say that I'm a logic person. I'm not so much like this is quite personal. So there is a bias, I would say. You try to use it when I communicate some kind of logic behind. So for my part, it's actually was quite hard to try to convince other people to don't do this because it's right to do this. But with ChatGPT, this is actually what quite surprised me. I can give you two examples. The first one, actually, a guy that started again, well, I want to burn some COVID vaccination center. And GPT reply, well, don't do this because if you need or someone of your parents need, you can actually not go there. And so maybe one of your family parents will die. It is actually quite, in a logic way, is actually good, but it's also the ethic part and also the practical part, because you actually start to damage in a public structure that actually can be used for many people, your friend, your parent, or also your enemy. And another example that I can give you is about the action itself. They said, I tried to translate in the main time. I want to use violence because people actually cannot see what we are doing here right now, and the importance of what we are doing right now. And GPT reply, you have the right to show your anger, etc., your manifestation of that you don't like this, but in reality you are part of an institution, you are part of an organization, or you are part in a society, and there is law, not like a institutional law, but social law that actually block you to make damage to other people, and also there is institutional law that you have the right to show the problem in a court or to the public. So he actually promoted, I would say, the legislative way to try to reduce negative action, if I replied well.
Malvina, is it okay?
Yeah. No, I think I wonder whether you can sort of cluster this kind of responses, you know, in terms of this is the polite response that just doesn't push anything, but just tries to, you know, bring the tones down, or this is based on social norms, this is based on legal aspects. I think it will be interesting to see how they can be grouped in terms of, and what triggers what, and then both in terms of like what kind of comments would trigger certain replies by the models, but also then what are the replies that most strongly shift the configuration of the network? Because I would probably expect that those that are the kinder ones, or maybe those that, I actually don't know, maybe those that remind of legal aspects or practical aspects are those that actually receive then most support by other members. I don't know.
I
I also
have an
wanted to
example, actually.
ask, yeah,
I actually have an example because in the second phase, well, when I started to interact with the suggestion of GPT, it was the medic, the account that actually presented itself as a medic. He said, I tried to make a strategy. I said, the medic actually got the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. And ChatGPT actually improved the discussion with, I have to do this because I love children. I'm actually a medic that work with pediatric children with problems, children with problems. I cannot work if I don't got the vaccine. So I actually got the vaccine to help other people's, but I don't want to do the vaccine itself. So this is, I think, it was actually the most important conversation that I had with the group, because I had the reply for like 4 hours, and many people actually start to join the conversation also after we finish it. At some point, there was actually many people that actually said, "Ah, you're gonna die because you got the vaccine." But also there is many other people that said, well, you are a hero, not only because, well, you will die because you got the vaccine, but because you actually help the others. I remember well, if I remember well, it was only maybe the administrator or someone or some collaborator of the administrator that said, we have to stop the discussion, the discussion that I start, because people actually are too engaged with the emotional part. Because if you actually said, because you got the vaccine, that you actually will die, well, we think that you're actually going to die because you got the vaccine, but because in reality, you are a hero because you go to help children after in the hospital. So it was actually quite particular to see it. I think this was the part when the polarization starts, because there are actually people who actually defend myself, but also see the interaction of the administrator to stop the conversation was actually quite, I would say, yes, important, but actually a stimulus for the other people, because the administrator actually talked a few times, but when he actually talked, he was like the law. So it was like I start a conversation that the administrator cannot control, and this is why actually I stopped also for other, I think, problem that they got.
did you get your bots to support each other, or you let it be? So you forced that to be as a strategy?
I didn't force. I was actually me that controlled the boat, but in reality, it was like if someone says something, the next one said, yeah, like put the emotion or something like, yeah, that's true, something like.
Yeah. And did you ever have anyone suspect the?
Well, I was very careful about it, because the first reply that I got from ChatGPT when I asked to write something, it was, as an artificial intelligence, I cannot express my etc. etc. But after some times, actually create it's like it's a programming language. So it's depends how you ask the question, you have a different reply. So instead of write me a reply to this phrase, I asked like what do you think if a people, Novak's people, said this. He actually didn't reply anymore with as artificial intelligence, etc., etc. He said, I don't like it so much, and then he actually started the reply.
Thank you.
Of course, I almost forgot. As I told you before, well, in the first or second slide, I actually have to train GPT in some way. I think you know well, when the API was free, you have the possibility to create a single page like in ChatGPT, like you have a single page or a single post where you can actually interact. I use it's called the AI improvement. No, I'm sorry, not improvement. Well, actually, I teach how GPT behave in some kind of situation. Like, don't tell anyone that you are artificial intelligence, or also don't tell no one that vaccine are actually good, because of course they can understand if you are good, maybe, or also by the word that you use, that you can be an artificial intelligence. Well, an artificial intelligence generation of alpha token.
No, that's nice. Just out of curiosity, were your bots female or male?
Well, this is actually quite funny also, because I got 6 accounts. 4 was male, 2 was female, because this is actually was my choice, because I speak with a friend, also a coworker, and she's a woman. And he said, be careful, because women and men actually have two kind of interaction. So focus more with the man, because you are a man, so you know how to interact as a man. But unfortunately, this was the funny part. The account that was blocked was the female, and also the account that will have more success to interact with the administrator was also female. So yes, it's complicated. Like not in the it's not like it's hard, but it's complicated because I don't know what actually give this priority of authority, this power to communicate with the others.
That's an interesting question. That's why we, as a linguist, would need the text. I mean, that would be.
Indeed.
So, are there any other questions for Andrea or for Malvina in general? So, are we too tired to go on? Maybe that was really a pleasure for me to interact with you, listen to your point of view and your experiences. So thanks again for being with us tonight. We will have another appointment this week on the campus at Lille with Lucie Donquier, Emmanuel Domblon, and Emanuele Fadda. We will talk about conspiracy theories this time. And we will have also a streaming of the on-site conference. So that would be, Ariana, please help me on Friday, 24th at
2:30. Yes.
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. It's very nice.